Hello and welcome back to the Lucid Dreaming Podcast. This is episode 28, and it's been a long time. I've missed you too. I know, but here we are. And I actually have two episodes in a row coming for you. I've recorded two interviews, and the first one is very timely, and we'll get to it in a second in today's episode. And the other one is with Jane Gackenbach, who, if you've been reading, and searching for lucid dreaming online, sooner or later you've probably encountered that name. She is a researcher who's been doing research and writing books about lucid dreaming, and more recently about video games and connection of video games to dreams and to lucid dreams. And she's a very interesting person who's been at it for a while, and that's coming up in the next episode. It's a short interview, but it's really interesting. And before we get to today's episode, I want to just give some brief sort of updates of what's been going on, or at least what I paid attention to recently in the world of lucid dreaming. And it obviously fits the interview of today, which is with Craig Weiss, who is the founder and CEO of a company who's building a lucid dreaming device called Aladdin. And obviously what's been going on recently is what's prompted this interview, but you'll see what I mean in a second. And what's been going on is that it seems like it's been raining Kickstarter campaigns recently. It started with a Kickstarter campaign for a device called iBand, which seems damn near identical to the iWink's Aurora. A little disturbingly so, if you ask me personally. But they claim to have some major differences, especially they're touting sleep improvements, functionality of sorts, and they have all sorts of random little extras here and there. But there's a lot that, to me at least, doesn't smell right about this campaign. It's already finished on Kickstarter. They raised a lot of money. They raised over $600,000 on Kickstarter, and nearly the same amount, if not more, on Indiegogo. In fact, they ran two campaigns at the same time, which smells even fishier than just the single campaign itself, which I only found out after the Kickstarter was done. So they're sort of double dipping, which I guess is not, against some rules. Maybe it is against the rules of either Kickstarter or Indiegogo. I'm not really sure. But the thing that bothered me the most about the campaign is that it doesn't seem like people who are passionate or even know all that much about lucid dreaming. A lot of sort of these canned kind of big words that people use and way to describe dreams and lucid dreams and this, that, or the other thing, the usual jargon that doesn't come with experience, in my view. The whole thing seems one thing they do seem really good at is marketing. They've marketed the hell out of this, and they've got on every promotion outlet and used all sorts of systems and this, that, or the other thing, and got their names everywhere, which is good for them. But I don't know. I just don't feel great about this campaign. And just so you see that I'm not harping on any company that's trying to build a device, or even because it's so similar to iWinks, you'll see in a moment that I do talk about some other ones. So let's move on to a device on Kickstarter called the Lucid Dreamer. We're going to talk about this in the interview as well. But the thing that's interesting about this is that this was the first device, at least to be put out to the public to fund, that relies on the mechanism from the famous Voss study, that is basically a brain stimulation device for lucid dreaming. And this one seemed legit to me in many ways. And there's some things that bothered me about the campaign, and I'm going to touch on those because I think it's important. But overall, these are people from the Netherlands who, for their jobs before getting into lucid dreaming devices, were dealing with their neurofeedback people. So they've been dealing with EEG, and as well as brain stimulation devices that are sometimes used for EEG and clinical treatments and such. So they have some background in this, and that was encouraging. And so I thought, okay, that's a good sign. The design seemed all right. It's not like a complete headband around the head, but rather a sort of device where you stick it to your forehead and pull electrodes out of that and stick those in the right locations. And all of that seemed great, except that the two things that bothered me very much, and maybe there was a reason for this, I don't know, maybe it's sort of lost in translation from the Netherlands, but the minimum device was going to cost 500 euros, which seems like a lot to me. And then they had two other tiers, each at an extra 200 euros from the tier below it, and each one was basically just more functionality in the app. So the app had locked functionalities that you can unlock in a sense by paying 200 euros extra or 400 euros extra. And in fact, the upper tier, which is basically all in all 900 euros, which is crazy, was dream sharing experiment applications. And now, in their defense, I would say that they weren't promoting, this supernatural possible dream telepathy kind of functionality as something that they know exists, and here now you could do it and blah blah blah. They were presenting the little more acceptable skeptic, like, hey, we don't know, but this will allow you to test an experiment, which is okay in theory. Like I'm fine with that, but and only to a certain degree. But to pay 900 euros or 400 euros extra, almost double the original price of the device for something that is basically extremely unscientific at this point, that I'm not okay with. And so that kind of gave me a bad taste about this device. And again, if you know me, you know that part of my issue is people giving a bad name or muddying the water. And there's enough, stuff in lucid dreaming that is, giving it a bad name or turning people away because of this kind of stuff, either whether it's New Age or other stuff, or just bad science. That I didn't like it. I did invite them to come on the podcast, but by the time I was traveling, by the time I came back, this has happened, is that they made an update to the Kickstarter campaign saying that even though their original testing was showing promise and was succeeding well, their additional testing was not as successful, and suddenly they think, oh, maybe they should add the mechanism of light and sound and cues to the device, which was very strange. This is not the purpose of this kind of technology. And I don't know that together that they would work better, perhaps in theory, but I'm not sure. And then shortly after that, they put an update that they're canceling the campaign, and this is after they've already raised their goal of $100,000, euro rather. And they said, look, we've done more tests, and this doesn't work to our standards. This doesn't work as well as we had hoped or thought that it would. And so basically, in so many words, they said that they don't feel comfortable taking people's money when they don't see that their device works as well as they have intended. And that takes a lot of honesty and a lot of integrity, and I applaud them for this. They've gained some new respect in my book for doing that, because it would be so easy to just continue taking money and you've already funded and just wait for the campaign to be over and then try to figure it out later. And instead they said, no, we're going to go back to the drawing board and we'll come back to you when we have something of value. And kudos, seriously, props for this move. It's not an easy move to do at the point that they were, and I applaud them for it. And so what brings us to today's interview is, interestingly enough, a day before they canceled their campaign, but after they've already said that their testings were not doing so well, a new Kickstarter campaign for a device called Aladdin showed up on Kickstarter. And this one was slightly different and is interesting in a couple of ways. And when I first looked at it, I was a little suspicious. It was a little sparse on details, and the design looked a little different in some ways, and there wasn't a lot of data as far as I'm concerned, like I love the geeky details. Like, prove to me that this works, convince me, tell me, show me your testing, show me your data, and so on. But the team looked very interesting. Like the Craig brought together, it seems like a high-end team of neuroscientists and a neurosurgeon and a person, as you'll hear in the interview, from Zio. So Zio, the sleep tracking device, I mentioned this one a couple of times on the podcast. So that was intriguing, and through the comments in Kickstarter, I asked a few questions and found out that they've actually done a clinical study basically trying to replicate the Voss study. And the number one complaint I hear from people, especially after the Lucid Dreamer got canceled, people are like, here's validation, this mechanism of brain stimulation doesn't work and it's all bullshit and nobody has replicated the Voss study. Well, here we have a clinical study that to one degree or another has successfully replicated inducing lucidity in test subjects in a lab, in a hospital, and that is very interesting. That, I think, is the first since the Voss study of somebody showing success in a laboratory settings. And that, I think, is, if that doesn't change people's minds until the time that we have a consumer version that works well, then I don't know what will. And that's when I got interested, and that's when me and Craig connected and bring him on the podcast to do this interview. So this is like a good hour when we really get into a lot of details, and I think you'll find it interesting. And I think that by the end of it, I got far more excited about this project than I did when I just glanced at it first. So you can take a look. And without further ado, I give you Craig Weiss. So today I have with me Craig Weiss of Aladdin, Dreamer, and Craig, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Jay, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. And I'm curious a little bit about your background, and we're going to get into the device that you're building and the Kickstarter campaign that you're running, obviously. Some very interesting stuff. But I'm curious how you got into lucid dreaming in particular, because I know that in the past I've been reading a little bit about you and saw that you were working with vastly different kind of industries.
Sure.
So I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I started having lucid dreams, probably a few decades ago, maybe, when I'm 43 now. So probably when I was maybe a teenager, I recall having my first lucid dream, and obviously was super intrigued by the experience as anybody who's had one, I think is. And I was originally a patent attorney by training, and so I should actually go back a step since it's probably relevant to lucid dreaming. So I was a philosophy major in college.
Cool.
And so to become a patent attorney, you have to have a bachelor's of science degree, and a philosophy degree is about the furthest thing away from a bachelor's of science degree. So I had to go back to school after law school, and so the way to qualify to take the patent bar, if you did not have a bachelor's of science degree, was you had to have what they considered to be the equivalent of a bachelor's of science degree. So I studied biology and chemistry, and that was really interesting, and it sort of was my first real introduction into the hard sciences and anatomy and physiology, and so it was interesting. It was certainly gave me a little bit of a foundation. And then I practiced patent law for more than 10 years. So, helping to obtain, patents for entrepreneurs and, inventors. And I met some really interesting people, and I ended up sort of really specializing, because of my biology and chemistry background, in a lot of medical device patents. So I met lots of interesting doctors, and sort of innovative doctors who were coming up with different types of medical devices for which I was able to help get them patents for their ideas. Mm-hmm. And so And it's funny, I had connected with Dan Lieberman, who's one of the members of my team on Aladdin, during this during the time that I was a patent attorney. So I was able to obtain several patents for different inventions for things that he'd come up with for brain and spinal surgery, and so. Well, what was really interesting was the patent firm that I was part of had been founded by my father about 40 years ago, and the four oldest sons all became IP attorneys. All ended up working in the family firm, and so because it was our firm, we considered ourselves kind of entrepreneurial, and so one of my brothers went to China in 2005 and saw kind of a crude version of an electronic cigar and thought that would make for a really interesting product, especially if somehow it could ever be innovated down to the size of a cigarette. And so it was sort of a venture of our law firms that he founded the company that was called Enjoy. And and so I started to get more involved in 2009. And then in 2010, I actually became president of Enjoy. And in 2011, I stopped practicing law and I became the CEO at Enjoy. And it was sort of a wild ride. I was never myself a smoker, but I got really, really interested and almost obsessed with this idea that you have about 1.3 billion smokers on the planet today. The World Health Organization said 1 billion people were going to die this century from smoking. And the more I looked into it, I realized that nicotine wasn't carcinogenic. What was killing smokers was not the nicotine, it was the delivery system. And so the idea that you could deliver nicotine to smokers in a way that was familiar to them with their cigarettes, but in a non-carcinogenic way, my view was that this was that we could have a company that could save more lives than Pfizer. And so I was really excited about that, and I took a real scientific approach. I had a lot of competitors who were just sort of in it to make a quick buck, and I was very focused on the science. So my chief scientist had an MD, PhD from Stanford and was a full tenured professor of biochemistry at Princeton. I recruited the 17th Surgeon General of the United States to serve on our board of directors. We did clinical studies. We published a clinical study. One of the studies that we did, we published in the American Journal of Health Behavior, and we just really took a very scientific approach to, well, how do we, in the most effective way possible, match the pharmacokinetic delivery of nicotine that you see in a combustion cigarette. How do we do that in our product? And so I did that for basically 4 years. I left Enjoy as CEO in 2014, and in 2014 happened to be when I had this particularly powerful dream with my dad. It was a lucid dream. So I'm with my father who passed away in 2008, and I realized that I'm dreaming and he's right in front of me. And I had this, really amazing experience. I was able to give him a hug, and I woke up with a feeling that, the feeling I had when I woke up was one that I never thought I would experience. It was basically the emotion of, I got to see my dad again. And it was just really, really it was a very kind of serene or comforting feeling, like the feeling of, it was so great to see him again. And it lasted for days and really stayed with me. And so right around this time was when this article was published in Nature by this team of 6 neuroscientists led by Dr. Ursula Voss, and she wrote about this this idea of using sort of a low current electrical stimulation during REM to stimulate lucid dreams. And what was fascinating to me was the conclusion that that her and the other 5 neuroscientists came to at the end of their paper was, well, this could be an effective treatment for
PTSD.
PTSD,
Yep.
people with chronic nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
And as an entrepreneur, my reaction was, well, of course that's true, but of course there's many more broader applications than just that narrow focus. And who in the world wouldn't want these experiences on a regular basis? And sort of the analogy that I often think about is the DVR. I say basically, look, before TiVo, no one was walking around saying, "Gosh, I wish I could digitally time shift my media content." But once you had it, you could never go back to the VCR. And similarly, most people, especially those who don't have lucid dreams, or certainly who don't have them regularly, they're not walking around saying, "God, I wish I could maximize the productive or entertainment value of my unconscious state." But but once you give that to people, no one's going to go back to being chased by a lion, or being unprepared for the test back in high school. I mean, no one wants those experiences, and if you can give them control and awareness, to me, in the early days when I started working on this, I would talk to people about it, and I talked to a guy who used to be one of the partners at Sequoia Capital, and one of the top VC funds in the world, and I had met him during sort of the heyday, with Enjoy, and Enjoy was an amazing experience for me. I learned a ton. Of course, I made mistakes, and I've hopefully have learned from those too. But there were some really neat things. I mean, we were very innovative. We would be in a conference room and draw on the whiteboard designs for products that in 6 months we would have on 50,000 shelves in the United States. And so we got really, really good at design, prototyping, manufacturing. And we ended up, in my tenure, I think we manufactured 80 million units of our products, and distributed them, I think, into about 130,000 doors all over the world. And so it was an incredible sort of, learning experience. And, I scaled up to 130 employees. We had employees in half a dozen countries and offices in 3 different continents. I mean, it was really an amazing experience. And we advertised our products, all over the world, on billboards, on, TV commercials, radio. It was really great. So I have those experiences under my belt, which, gives me a confidence with this venture that, that maybe a lot of people don't have, having built one previous company at scale that involved, manufacturing. And I guess I would say with Enjoy, I actually think that was a lot more complicated than what I'm doing with Aladdin, because that involved integrated circuits, power source, heating elements, vaporization, advanced biochemistry, and lots of things had to happen in a very small form factor. So basically, for me, as I started to, I mentioned, I talked to this former partner at Sequoia, and I said, hey, if I could deliver a consumer product, a comfortable wearable that you'd put on your head when you go to sleep at night, and that would give people the ability for, up to 2 hours a night to live out their dreams and fantasies, and be able to do whatever they want without any consequences, what do you think the average person would pay for that? And he said about 20% of their annual net income. And I was like, okay, I think I'm onto something here. I think clearly people would value this. And so, and of course, it doesn't cost that much, right? So, so in any event, I started down this path, and I did a lot of what I did at Enjoy. I reached out to, really, really smart people, doctors, neuroscientists, brain surgeons, and to get their help on and what I realized when I did my research was that there's lots of companies out there, but they mostly fall into kind of a few different buckets. So you've got the people that are using, visual and audible cues, the flashing lights and the audible cues And that technology's been around for maybe 30 years or so. And it's, I don't want to say it's largely ineffective, but it's sort of like the proof is in the pudding. If it really worked, then everyone would be using those. And I mean, they'd be a mainstream product. And so you have also the pharmacological angle, approach.
Yep. Yep.
And so you've got companies that are sort of pursuing that. Not many people, just because it happened so recently with the Voss paper in 2014, have taken the electrical stimulation route. A couple have, but across sort of all of those companies, I wasn't able to see anybody taking a really serious scientific approach. And
Right.
it was all just kind of brain hackers or entrepreneurs or other people. And hey, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm not trying to bag on entrepreneurs, but they weren't people that I think were taking a really serious scientific approach. So the people I contacted, one of the first things that we decided to do was to get IRB clinical trial approval to conduct a human clinical trial to replicate the Voss findings. To me, the very first step was we had to be able to prove that this was real. And so, I knew I couldn't, have any credibility if I were to say, well, it worked with me, or I did it with some friends in my garage, so, so we got IRB clinical trial approval, which, is not nothing in the sense that they don't just hand those out. And,
Right.
we had to put together a serious proposal. And so we got approval. We conducted a clinical trial at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. We were able to successfully replicate the findings from Nature. And what was, it was a fascinating learning process. We did each subject, and it was a small study of only 12 people. But what's interesting about it being only 12 people is that it has to be even more statistically significant when you have fewer subjects to in terms of satisfying statistical
Right.
deviations. And so it was really interesting is, each subject spent 3 nights in the sleep lab. One night we ran sort of 2 different stimulation protocols. Another night we ran another, sort of a 3rd and 4th stimulation protocol. And another night was what's called sham, where the subject's hooked up to everything, but it's not turned on. So
Right.
they're, unaware that, that it's in essence the placebo night. And of course we mixed up which night was which for each subject. And
Was it also double blind? So even for the testers, it's
yeah,
unknown?
so it was, we debated whether to make it double blind or just single blind. And in the end, it was single blind, not double blind. And we just decided for that. The reason we decided to make it single blind is just as a practical purpose from my perspective. I was more interested in getting the data quicker because I didn't want to wait the extra 3 months to find out all of the findings. And so I figured it was just going to be helpful to me to learn as we went. So we,
No, was the rest of the study replicated pretty closely in terms of the same setup or equipment that they used, or did you wake them up shortly after stimulation, or give them some more time? Because that was one of the complaints I've heard about the original study. And also, I'm really curious, and again, just tell me as much as you feel comfortable to on how did you determine their state of lucidity? Like did you ask the participants, and what was
sure.
some of the answers?
So we did, when I say,
Because let me just point out the reason I really wanted to, partially the reason I really wanted to talk to you, and why I am now definitely excited, because I'm suspicious about everybody. There's so many devices and people working on stuff, and like you said yourself, some are just like, hey, this could theoretically work. Let's cobble something together and let's just give it a go. Instead of doing a more at least even semi-scientific something. And so when I find out you did run a clinical study on this, I got very excited, because the number one complaint I hear from just people, lucid dreaming aficionados, about the when I mentioned the Voss study and why the Voss study is actually potentially great is that, oh, nobody's replicated it. There is no second experiment, same or otherwise, and I think it sounds like there finally is one, to one degree or another at the very least. So that's really, really cool.
Yeah, and so yeah, to answer your questions, look, we the PhD who's the director of the sleep center at Henry Ford, he actually spoke to Dr. Ursula Voss and about our study findings after we concluded them, and she's the one who was the first person to say, "Wow, looks like you replicated our findings." So
awesome.
From that perspective, we were, obviously very excited. And one of the things that Dr. Drake at Henry Ford, said to me at the time was, it's basically statistically impossible for there to be an effect that is produced by one set of scientists that is then replicated by a different, in a different study, and for that to be a coincidence. Like, there's clearly an effect that's occurring here, that's been demonstrated in now 2 studies. And so that was obviously very exciting moment for us. And so we made some of what we did intentionally to mimic exactly the setup that Voss did, so that we could demonstrate replicatability. But then we also wanted to make some changes to see if we could, in fact, improve upon what was done. And so we did both. We replicated and did precisely what she did, and then we also did other things in terms of waking people up at different times and trying out different, what are called, a different montage, as it's called, or different electrode placements to be able to see if that would have an effect. And we were able to notice differences. Part of it's a little bit of a challenge in comparing what we did to what she did was, so if you ask the question, as you know probably, to the general population, have you ever in your entire life had a dream in which you knew you were dreaming? The answer is about 50% of the people say yes.
Yeah.
And so what Voss did in her study was she selected as participants only from the other 50% who said no.
People who said no. Yeah.
Right. So she had only sort of lucid dreaming naive participants. And for our study, we didn't sort of pre-select for either category. So as a result, we had people who had lucid dreams before, just like you would expect from the general population. And so, part of our results, so for example, we had a higher rate of lucidity in sham than Voss did in her study, but that would be expected, right? Because if you've got people who've had lucid dreams before and they put on, they're hooked up with all of these electrodes, some of those people are going to have a lucid dream even if they're not turned on. And so, and the funny thing from my perspective was, I wasn't, nor were the people involved in the study, particularly troubled by this. In fact, I actually thought of it as almost a positive because, I thought, well, we shouldn't be penalized for the fact that people are having lucid dreams, right? And if anything, even if some of it is a placebo effect, that's okay too. If at the end of the day, what we're most interested in is people having lucid dreams. But even when you factored in the sham night, we still had statistical significance.
And I'm not against the theory that just like with trying to induce lucidity with intention alone, if you prime yourself and then add an additional method on top of it, which sort of pushes it over the edge, I can see that as a possibility. I don't know that that's how it works, but I've postulated that that's actually possible.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting if that's part of it in some cases.
So it's funny you say
obviously
that.
Not in the sham, but
right.
Yeah, but otherwise.
Well, it's funny you say that. So that was part of our experiment as well. We tried. We didn't do any priming with respect to setting your intention, but we did do some priming of content. And but I've had the very question that you just raised. I actually had that conversation with Dr. Stephen LaBerge. Who's I think,
Of course.
the world's most leading expert in lucid dreaming. I was fortunate enough, I got to spend 4 days with him
Oh
at
wow.
his lucid dreaming retreat in Hawaii
Oh yeah.
I think it was about a month ago. And in fact, I went with Josh Klein, who's also featured in my video. So the two of us, he's MD, PhD from Yale, head of hospital neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is Harvard Medical School's chief training hospital, and he's on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. And so the two of us went out there and spent 4 days with Dr. LaBerge, and that was one of the topics of conversation, and we all three agreed actually with your hypothesis that clearly the most effective means of stimulation is going to be a combination.
Hmm.
And what it comes down to for me, the way I think about this sort of conceptually or philosophically is, there are people who, of course, work really hard at this. They read books, they set their intention, they do meditations, they do lots of things. And some of those people are successful. But the reality is it's just really hard to consistently have lucid dreams through those sort of practices alone. And the analogy I give for this one is it's sort of like saying, how would you like to have the body of a swimsuit model? It's really simple. You just have to do two things. It's only 3 words: eat healthy and exercise. And it's like, well, yeah, but those are hard disciplines to maintain, which is why
Right.
most people don't do them. And it's the same kind of thing, I think, with lucid dreaming, because in his book, Dr. LaBerge's book, Exploring the World of Lucid Dreaming, he said something that I talked to him about last month in Hawaii that I just thought was really profound, which was that this guy who could lucid dream at will whenever he wanted to, if he wasn't concentrating and setting his intention, he would only have a lucid dream once a month.
Hmm.
So it's like, it shows you it's a discipline. And so this idea of making it easier, that's what to me gets me really excited. And so yeah, one of the other questions you asked, in terms of how do we measure lucidity. So because we because the people I was involved with were scientists, and sleep scientists, their view was there was only one scientifically approved way to measure lucidity, which was to use the standard that Voss used in her Nature study. So that's this like 20 question questionnaire, which is the like lucidity scale, which I guess has been created and accepted in the scientific community. And I'm not purporting to say that that's the gold standard of lucidity. It's just what's been used in the scientific community and what seems to be accepted, because there's a concern that it's too subjective to just ask people, well, did you have a lucid dream? And so instead they ask, 20 different questions that are they're sort of measured against, there's a statistical analysis in terms of,
Right.
and so we measured lucidity by the same sort of standard as Nature based on this questionnaire. And I would say on the one hand I was satisfied and happy with the results, but on the other hand, there's, to me, one of the conclusions I had after the Nature study was, after our study, was that there's still work to be done to me on 2 different levels, which is, one is on the frequency of the experience, how often it's occurring, and then also on the quality. And by quality, what I really mean specifically is control. Some people have what is referred to as insight, which is one of the measurements on the questionnaire. They're aware that they're dreaming, but they don't have control over the dream. And don't get me wrong, I think that can be extraordinarily valuable. For example, to the 5 to 10% of the population who suffer from chronic nightmares and from the PTSD community, just knowing that it's not real would be extremely helpful, to people who are having nightmares. But I think for people who aren't suffering from a bad experience, just awareness alone is not all that exciting relative to, of course, having control. And so So, we've done some things that, I would put maybe a little more into the, proprietary, bucket,
Sure.
that we're excited about, that we feel have been, positively correlated with control. And so yeah, we're at a point right now. It's actually one of the really, I think, cool things about Kickstarter, which is that you have people who get to this kind of chicken and the egg moment where they say, okay, I've done a bunch of work. Now I need to get to this place where I can deliver a product. But in order to get to that place, I need capital. I need money to be able to do that. And how do I get there? And then you have this sort of Kickstarter to help bridge that gap, which is, okay, well, we'll pre-purchase your product. You use the money to deliver the product, and then it becomes kind of a win-win. And so that's why I turned to Kickstarter at this stage.
Yeah, yeah, and I am curious to ask you about. I mean, let me just comment, put a few comments about what you said earlier, because there's some interesting things about it. For me, first of all, the lucid scale, I think, despite trying to actually be more granular and more sort of specific and more accurate, less subjective, I guess, I find it a little less useful in trying to determine, because I do find that when you speak to people in a sort of short back and forth conversation, you can tease out if they actually were lucid or if they're confusing it with something else. Or if you just ask about general details, sure, you can get an indication of whether they were a little more self-conscious, a little less, or a little more were able to exert control over the dream or not. But I do think that there is something. I do think that just lucidity alone, and it's not binary from my experience. Although there is a point after which the not being lucid is very clear. Meaning, sometimes it feels like a switch. You're not aware that you're dreaming, and suddenly it's so obvious that it's ridiculous. Although you can tether on the edge, and that happened to me and many other people many times.
Absolutely.
But it is a sort of spectrum. But I think there is extreme value for people, especially people who've never had it, but people who had it very briefly, or just in general, a lot of value of just crossing that barrier. And it is my theory, even in terms of control, because I don't think lucid dreaming is just about control, and I think that there is value to having very clear and very lucid dreams where you don't exert control over the dream. But we can get into that if you want. But I think that it's completely legitimate that control over your dream is the gateway drug of lucid dreaming. It's like what gets you in the door. People want to be able to go flying and live out their fantasies, and I think that's absolutely fine. But I also have the theory that increasing your sort of where you fall on the spectrum of lucidity on a regular basis will sooner or later increase your ability. It's like almost a skill. As soon as you become lucid on a regular basis, control will follow sooner or later.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and if you found a way to accelerate that, all the better. I think that would be really cool, and that is something that people are looking for. But the barrier to entry right now for most people, a vast majority of people, and like you described yourself, it's very hard practice to do, is just getting through the door. It's just becoming lucid. After which, sure, they'll have some more work to do to be able to control the dream or manifest all sorts of things. And so on.
So look, I agree with a lot of what you've just said, and I mean, what's interesting about the lucidity scale is there's this interesting category called disassociation, and that's this experience that maybe many of us have had where you see yourself in the dream, sort of almost as a third party, and.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about that is, so some people I've heard argue, well, that's not really lucidity, right? Because you're not necessarily aware that you're dreaming, you don't have control, but you're watching yourself. And so I think that's a legitimate, sort of discussion, right, about whether or not that's lucidity.
Sure.
But what's interesting about it, and I've had those dreams, and we had people in our study have that experience. What's interesting about it is, again, I do see value in it, because one of the dreams I personally had with disassociation was that I'm watching myself, and I was in a difficult situation, like it was a stressful situation, and I found it less stressful that I felt like it
Sure.
wasn't happening directly to me, even though it was me, because I was sort of watching myself, and I felt a little of that disconnect between
Yeah.
myself and the stressful situation. So, but yeah, I think, look, there's,
I,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to interject quickly before you move on, because I think that the people who might consider that not count towards lucidity, maybe, or rather to say, people who are familiar with the effects of meditation, for example, long-term meditation, where there is not disassociation, but in a way to change your state of consciousness in such a way where you are not as a self so embedded in everything you see and experience, just in waking life and regular waking life. And I think that's a similar experience in dreams, where it's actually more easy for it to occur, especially if you're running around, your body's running around in third person perspective, and you realize that you are the watcher from the sky,
Right.
or something like that. And that definitely holds value, but it's just an experience that people are not used to in waking life. And so they think, oh, it's different or weird or doesn't count towards lucidity because, here's that character running around, and supposedly that's me, but, it just feels very differently. But I do think it does count towards lucidity, and I do think it has value on its own once people start exploring it more.
Yeah, so I'm sort of in your camp right now, in the same way, and so, but so the funny thing about it is, for anyone who's ever spent the night in a sleep lab, which unfortunately I have, it's sort of like it's sort of like an oxymoron. I mean, you don't really sleep, at least not very well, in a sleep
Yeah.
lab. And of course, you're in our case, in Voss's study and in ours, you're waking people up basically every 90 minutes, and asking them to fill out a questionnaire. I mean, it's kind of so silly, and so.
Yeah, and their head is full of electrodes and wires
Yeah,
coming out.
exactly.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And so, there's very little about it that's natural. And so, to me, that was one of the big things that I was interested in was, not only does this have to be a wireless experience, not only does it have to be a comfortable experience, and of course, it's got to be something that you're doing in the comfort of your own bedroom and not, in some sleep lab somewhere, but it's really got to be fairly seamless. And so, so one of the people on my team that I'm so excited about that's in the video is, John Shambroom. And John was basically the head scientist over at Zeo. And,
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
So what's cool about Zeo, for those who don't know, is they were the first company really to develop a commercial product. It was a very comfortable headband that did EEG monitoring, and they were able to tell you what stage of sleep you were in and for how long. And
It was ahead of its time.
it was super ahead of its time. And John was there, throughout the whole experience. And there were those people who had a Zeo and just swore by it and loved it and thought it was the greatest thing ever. In fact, Dan Lieberman, who's in the video, he told me about Zeo 6 years ago, and just raved about it. And but one of the things that happened to them was that all of these companies came out, Fitbit and Jawbone, and they basically said, "Oh, we do sleep monitoring too, and it's $99, and you wear it on your wrist." And it really kind of ended up, destroying Zeo. But what's sad about it is, those wrist-worn devices are really inaccurate, and they,
Yeah.
and so Zeo was super accurate, and they had done an amazing amount of work and research to become, extraordinarily accurate. But they're measuring your brain waves. They really did know what stage of sleep you were in and when, and so that was one of the reasons why I was so excited to be working with John, because that he understands better than anybody, and that was a critical component of what we're doing. And so, but it gets back to So
No, I totally agree. I mean, I've complained about the fact that there are no proper sleep trackers on the market since Zeo went, out of business, and everybody else is touting, sleep tracking from Beddit to Fitbit and all of those, and nobody is touching your head, which is absurd. So it makes perfect sense to me. I think also why you're incorporating obviously EEG, not just for the sake of detecting REM, but also to give sleep tracking, which I think
Exactly.
is crucial and important on its own, which allows you to add the smart alarm feature, which is awesome. But I did want to go back to about the Kickstarter and ask you a little bit about the sort of chicken and egg moment, because I'm curious. It is a tough challenge. I totally understand that, and I'm curious if and how much did you do any additional testing with the prototype that came after the study before launching the Kickstarter? I mean, have you done additional sort of tests with whatever current prototype you have since?
So, the testing that we've done with our prototypes, I wasn't in a position to afford to do clinical testing with those prototypes.
Right.
So,
Right. I'm talking about just regular,
yeah. So, I mean, you'll laugh, but I think for me, the tipping point was, I used it and I had lucid dreams with it. So I kind of felt like, all right, well, that's,
that's okay for me.
Yeah, I mean,
I think I give that a pass for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm an N of one, and so that's not. But from my experience, the obvious skeptic would say, well, yeah, but Craig, this is what you're doing. You want to have lucid dreams, but what's interesting is I'm not having lucid dreams on my own, all the time.
Exactly.
They're a relatively rare event, and I've been living and breathing lucid dream, Aladdin for 2 years, and I'm still only having a lucid dream maybe once every, I don't know, 4 to 8 weeks. And so for me to have these experiences personally, and there were other members of my team that did as well. And so, in fact, one member of my team literally had his first lucid dream in like 20 years. And so, wow. After wearing the device. So, that it's again, probably, more anecdotal than scientific, just because we didn't do it in a clinical setting. But that for me was when I realized, okay, and it's time to take this sort of, to the next level.
Yeah. And it's, again, this is very interesting, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but just in case you're not aware, one of the competitors, the Lucid Dreamer guys, the people from the Netherlands, who raised over 100,000 on Kickstarter, just canceled their campaign 2 days ago.
I saw that.
So, and they're claiming, again, props to them for the honesty and integrity of not continuing the campaign if they're not confident with their device, instead of just taking the money and figuring it out later, saying that their original testing showed promise and seemed to have worked. But then every test since then has not produced the results that they wanted, and so they want to go back to the drawing board, which, again, I thought was admirable. But it's also perhaps to some degree a cautionary tale of like expanding your scope of testing to establish some kind of, because again, people always wonder, well, how well does it work? Does it work for everybody? How many people does it work for? And that's all stuff that will be figured out in time, but is something that is good to establish as early as possible, of, how well does this thing work to the vast majority of people. And it doesn't need to be flawless, I don't think, but that's interesting thing to think
about. I agree. And so, I thought it was, I was aware of them on Kickstarter, and I was aware that they had been fully funded. I thought it was, the timing was interesting, that basically we launched, and I think within 24 hours of us launching, they canceled. Now maybe it was a coincidence.
I think their update about the fact that it's not been working well came before you launched your Kickstarter. Okay. So unless they knew about it, I think this is.
It very well could have been a coincidence. So, and this just gets back to. So I agree. I think it is a cautionary tale, but I think this gets back to, John had made a comment. John Shambroom, one of our neuroscientists, he made a comment that it's sort of, when people ask me what's the difference between Aladdin and everybody else, I always kind of come back to this comment, which is, the Voss study that was published in Nature, was not a recipe.
Right.
My mother-in-law has a line that I always liked. She said, if you can read, you can cook. Basically they have these things called, recipes, and, you read them and then you follow them, and then, you make food. And Voss was not a recipe. It basically opened the door to.
It's a proof of concept.
It's a proof of concept, and so
For sure.
What I think others have done is they treated it as a recipe. So they basically said, "Oh, well, we're just going to do basically the exact same thing that they did, and we're going to get these incredible lucid dream experiences."
I'm gonna go a step further than that and say that some and say that some of them seem to have read the recipe wrong as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true as well. And so for us, we said no. What Voss did was it was a proof of concept. They opened the door, and now someone's got to go into go through that door, turn the lights on, and figure it out. And so who's going to do that? Which is the crackerjack team that's going to basically, in a scientifically systematic and methodical way, turn the dials and figure it out. And for us, I have tremendous confidence that we're those people.
Very cool. I mean, it's again, and I told you this over email. It's weird in some weird way, and this shouldn't be the case, but I feel sort of protective of the lucid dreaming industry or community or something like that, because I do see the potential. Again, for some reason, lucid dreaming in general is fraught with a lot of nonsense that comes along the way, because it's such a weird fringe state of consciousness and a phenomena, and it comes with a lot of new age nonsense, if as far as I would call it. And again, I do think it holds the key to some things that we're not quite ready to digest in terms of insights into consciousness itself, perhaps, or effect on the body, or how deep can we go directly into subconscious and make changes and overcome nightmares or stuff like that. There's a lot of unknowns. But there's a lot of stuff that, people just shove into lucid dreaming. And in addition to that, it seems people like to try to capitalize on people who don't care much about lucid dreaming, seem to want to capitalize on the industry because it's becoming more popular, and now technology is, taking hold as well. And so I'm weary when I see that, like, the lucid dreamer guys added a feature for dream telepathy. I'm like, okay, I'm open-minded, but adding €400 to your device that's already €500 is for that plays on the fact that people might believe that it's possible to do dream telepathy and dream sharing. It just doesn't feel right to me, and it just bugs me in a way it's like no other. Especially, and the same thing when I see inaccuracies when people talk about lucid dreaming or something. I'm always like looking at people's videos or marketing materials and it becomes very obvious if they even care about lucid dreaming or know about lucid dreaming, would just be by the sheer amount of inaccuracies in their info or how they try to sell it. So.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's part of why I really went into this, because when I looked at the landscape, the competitive landscape, I didn't see any real professionals out there who were taking this seriously. And I hope the one thing from my video that people take away is that these are serious people who are committed to the science. I mean, I think at least for me, when I watch the video, and even if you put me aside, since I'm not a neuroscientist, if you take a look at the other three, I don't think you can look at these neuroscientists and MDs and brain surgeons and say, they're just a bunch of scam artists. I don't think, brain surgeons and Harvard Medical School faculty members, get involved in scams, that they're committed people. And as am I to doing this in the right way, in a scientific way. And, we believe in the process of being able to stimulate lucid dreams.
No. And again, I would say to your credit, because, I think bringing together people who are really good at what they do and can put together something that really does work and look at it scientifically is not only very important, it's not easy to do. And even though it is easy enough with funding to get someone with a PhD to say something on your behalf, it's a different story than bringing people who, at least as far as I can tell, are really legit people and really legit industries, and not just someone with a degree that can talk on someone's behalf. You seem to have brought together people who, as far as I can tell, already know what they're doing, and that's very interesting to me. Again, just the people from the Netherlands who have some experience in terms of neurofeedback and EEG and stimulation, but you took it a few steps further, and that's very encouraging. And doing the clinical trial is very, very encouraging. And my hope and my desire, as someone who has had plenty of lucid dreams, and someone who is still, again, if I don't put a lot of effort into it, my lucid dreams disappear in an instant. All I want at the end of the day is that the public will have an affordable and practically effortless device that can give them access to lucidity. That's all I want at the end of the day.
I have the exact same goal. And so that's exactly what I want to accomplish. And look, I with your help, and the help of other sort of backers on Kickstarter, we're going to be able to achieve that goal. And so I appreciate your support, and obviously to the extent that you're an influencer in the community, that you can encourage others, whether it's the other backers on the Netherlands thing who obviously were interested in a product and now can't get theirs. I'd love for those people to come over, and anybody else that has this, the desire for these experiences. And, it's, the thing that's also really cool is people who've had the experience want it more, but even people who've never had it, when I talk to them and I explain what it is, they'd love to try it. They'd like, the idea that they could have this experience where, even as it's described, people are interested in that. And so,
this is definitely one of those things, I believe, that most people don't even know yet how much they will want.
That's exactly
once
right.
they get a glimpse of it. Yeah.
No, there's no question.
It's quite remarkable. I'm going to let you go in a moment, and you've been very generous with your time. But just two quick questions.
Sure.
One, I was just curious about the app itself and beyond. I know it has the sleep tracking data and a dream journal and a smart alarm and tips for lucid dreaming in general, I think. But does it give the user any kind of control over the stimulation or algorithm or patterns, or is that really done mostly on its own in terms of the app?
So look, that's a great question, and I would say we haven't finalized. There's sort of three different ways to go about this, and we're still sort of settling on which is the right approach. So one approach is the user, we determine the best algorithm, and the user doesn't have to sort of make that guesstimation on their own. So that's sort of one approach: simple, easy, and presumably effective. The second approach is, okay, there's you can choose, in essence, from a menu, right? These are the following stimulation protocols that we've found to be effective, and that's potentially a second one. The third one, which I think is very interesting, is an approach in which you start off. Well, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can either start off with just EEG detection only without any stimulation, and we can kind of establish a baseline for when you're in REM and for how long and what does your sort of EEG look like. And then we can start stimulating, maybe, for example, like on the third night or something. And but also, let's say for the sake of argument that someone puts on the device and they don't have a lucid dream the first night, they have it on the fifth night. Well, so what's interesting there is we can now compare your EEG activity for that fifth night with the previous 4 nights and start to make some comparisons. And we could even potentially use it as, in essence, a form of biofeedback to be able to customize the stimulation protocol for you specifically based on what was effective on that fifth night. And so that's also something that we're looking into. And so, for me, I'm a former patent attorney, so we filed patent applications, of course, on all of this stuff.
Right.
But yeah, so that's sort of still I would put into the sort of to be determined category.
Right.
But it's not because we haven't sort of put a lot of thought into it. It's just not clear to me what's the best approach out of the gate.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah. And the last question is about just strictly in terms of the electrodes. Like, is the setup such that it's, replaceable electrodes where people would have to buy on some regular basis at some cost, basically paying per dream or paying per night?
Sure. So there's sort of basically two options here. One is replaceable electrodes, so presumably they'd be reusable for some period of time, but then you'd have to have replacements, call it weekly or something, depending
Yeah.
on the type. The other possibility is we haven't ruled out the possibility of a dry electrode technology.
Hmm.
And John actually, really helped pioneer that at Zeo. They used a dry electrode
Right.
technology. So
Right.
that's something that we have the technical sophistication on, and we haven't given up on that as a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little different for reading brainwaves and stimulating,
Correct.
I think.
Correct.
Yeah, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, it's there's a lot still to figure out nuance, but it sounds very very promising overall. And again, thank you for coming on the podcast and talking to me and being so forthcoming with a lot of the details. Now I'm, to be honest, very excited about how this campaign goes and how you guys do, and look forward to hearing more.
Well, I really appreciate it, Jay. Thanks so much, and I know I can count on you to help make it a success. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you want to, I will put the link in the show notes. You can probably view it within your podcasting app, or if you're listening on YouTube, you'll see it in the description or in the show notes on lucidsage.com/28. You'll be able to see the link to Aladdin as well as the other Kickstarter campaigns that I've mentioned in this episode. You can also go to Kickstarter and search for Aladdin, or go to aladdindreamer.com and you can find the Kickstarter campaign. So once again, thanks to Craig for joining me on this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you want to support this podcast, I am now on Patreon, and you can go to patreon.com/luciddreaming or go to lucidsage.com/support and support this podcast with as little as $1 per episode. And since I don't do that many episodes, it won't cost you that much. So I'm a pretty affordable podcast, I must say. So anyone that supports the podcast, I really, really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at contact@lucidsage.com, or better yet, find me on Twitter at @thelucidsage. And once again, next episode is with Jane, and it's a fun interview, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, sweet and lucid dreams.